Hello and welcome to our Mental Wellbeing podcast brought to you by the Together We Can project here at Fever FM. In this 4-part series, I'll be talking to consultant psychiatrist Dr. Mahmood about different aspects of mental wellbeing and how you can implement them into your life. Last week, we talked about breathing and the power of breathing, and today we will be delving into the world of sleep. So first, I'd like to say hello to Dr. Khan and thank you very much for coming onto our show again.
Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
It's lovely to talk to you again. So sleep is, as I said, the topic that we are talking about today. Why have you chosen to talk about sleep?
So we mentioned last time well-being and the different components that make up well-being. Sleep is a key aspect of maintaining our well-being. So like breathing, sleep has a major impact on our health and well-being in general. Poor sleep impacts on all aspects of our lives. In particular, it impacts on our healthcare system. It can impact on the education system and even how effectively our economy runs. We spend about a third of our lives asleep, but we know so little about it. There is a growing movement in the world that advocates if more people were aware of and improve their breathing and sleeping, we would have less conflict in the world. In a nutshell, we'd have fewer wars.
Well, I think that's a very powerful way to start this podcast off. So, if I bring Islam into this a little bit, I know plenty of people who will, and as I do myself, will get up before sunrise to pray Fajr. Does our religion have a role to play in sleep?
Our sleep habits are often influenced by culture and religious beliefs. Lots of religious literature is rich in descriptions of sleep, and Islam is no exception. Sleep is a major distinction between God, who doesn't sleep, and his creation, we need to sleep. So Islam considers sleep to be one of the great signs of God, and Muslims are strongly encouraged to explore and understand this sign, and it's repeatedly mentioned in the Quran. The sleep pattern of Muslims is strongly influenced by prayer times. The Islamic prayer times are set according to the movement of the earth around the sun, and both the Quran and Hadith talk a lot about the importance of sleep hygiene, but most Muslims are unaware of how to improve their sleep. One misconception is quite common, is that people who are close to God tend not to sleep as much at night. The more you sleep, the closer you are to God. And it is a bit of a misconception, this really. I can imagine during the month of Ramadan when you're encouraged to worship more, do all your prayers, and in particular on the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, to actually stay awake as long as you can. But that night is very, very special. So you can imagine why Islam would say this particular night, stay up as much as you can, but it doesn't say do it all the time.
So I think that's a really nice way, again, to start off and bring Islam into how important sleep is. I'd like to ask a very, very basic question now. What is sleep?
So the definition again of sleep, if you looked it up in the Oxford Dictionary, quite a long-winded definition. But if I just break it down, it's a state which impacts on the body and the mind. It occurs several hours every night, so it's a recurring thing, which we'll come back to a bit later. It's a state in which the nervous system, our brains in particular, are relatively inactive. Our eyes are closed, our muscles are relaxed, and consciousness is practically suspended. Sleep, as you'll have seen from what I've said, is a really complex state. And for thousands of years, some of the greatest thinkers, scientists and religious figures have tried to unravel its mysteries with little success. If I was to live for roughly 60 years, I would spend on average about a third of that time asleep. 20 years of my life is spent asleep. And during this state of sleep, I'm, first of all, not socializing. I'm not looking for food. I'm not eating food. I'm not reproducing. I'm not protecting people around me. In fact, I'm really in a vulnerable state. So this 20 years of my life that I would spend sleeping, what's the benefits of it? And that's the kind of thing I think we need to raise awareness for people to start thinking about. So it's only recently that scientific research and medicine has started to unravel the sleep puzzle and the importance of sleep and what it does in terms of maintaining our well-being.
No, that's really interesting to hear, and it's quite scary, when you think 20 out of 60 years you're effectively unconscious, so it's a very big thing to take in. So my next question is, what makes us sleep?
Another way of asking that question is, how does our bodies know when it's time to sleep? So again, quite complex, but to simplify it, there's two main factors that determine when we sleep and when we wake up. The first factor is what we would call our circadian rhythm or cycle. And the second factor is a sleep chemical that builds up in our brains that encourages or pushes us to sleep. So a combination of both these factors working together is what's important.
Could you explain a little bit more about circadian rhythm that you mentioned, please?
So our circadian rhythm is our internal body clock. We all have a time wristwatch, let's say, which is located in our brains. And that regulates the sleep-wake cycle and repeats roughly every 24 hours.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that reminds me of my grandma, actually, because I live off of using an alarm clock. But my grandma, every single day, no matter what time she goes to sleep, she will wake up at the exact time for prayer every single day. And it must be because she has that internal body clock, which is amazing to think about.
Yes, very true. And I suppose why it's there is, since the dawn of time, sunlight in particular is the most reliable repeat signal that practically everything is influenced by. So during daytime with light we're active, and at night with darkness we tend to sleep. Our internal body clocks are regularly reset by daylight as the earth rotates around the sun. It's worth mentioning that this circadian rhythm, this alternation of night and day, is mentioned 37 times in the Quran. And again, it's one of God's signs that we are asked to think and reflect on.
So you've mentioned, or we've talked about internal body clocks. So why do some people have the ability or prefer to get up early in the mornings? Because personally, I am a night person, and I find it really hard. As much as I want to get up in the mornings, I find it really hard to motivate myself to get up in the morning early. So why is that different for different people?
So each individual person has their own specific sleep rhythm. Roughly 40% of the population are what we might call morning larks. They go to bed early, they get up early. That's my 10-year-old daughter, okay? No matter what time she goes to bed as well, you think she's going to stay in late. She doesn't. She just wakes up at the right time again in the morning. And roughly 30% of people are what we'd call night owls. They go to bed late and they get up late. The rest of the population falls somewhere in between, okay? So my son is a night owl, okay? He's 16 years old. Tomorrow, in fact.
Wow.
So he's a night owl. I think I probably fall in between those two groups of people.
Yeah.
So research shows that this sleep rhythm is not all by choice. It is actually genetically determined. So we need to spare a thought for night owls.
Yeah.
They get a raw deal on two counts. First of all our work schedules, including going to school, tend to run a kind of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. cycle. So night owls are forced to get up early despite going to bed late. Secondly, night owls wake up sleep deprived because their internal sleep-work cycle is disrupted. And often, night owls are described as being lazy people, when really the odds are stacked against them. It's worth noting that there are some countries, including those in Europe, which actually their school start time is later on in the day, and it's to try and offset that a little bit.
So is there a different way to try to understand the working of our internal body clock? You mentioned it's almost like we have a wristwatch inside of us. Could you go into a little bit more detail about that?
So the first really easy way to look at how our internal body clock is affected is when we lose or gain an hour when clocks go forward and backwards. And we all know when that happens how we feel after we gain an hour of sleep or lose an hour of sleep. So that's the first one. The second one is to think about what happens when we travel and what we call jet lag. So imagine thousands of years ago, human beings walked around a lot and perhaps rode from one place to another. They didn't travel large distances quickly, and their internal body clock had time to adjust from one day to another. The invention of the jet engine has meant we can travel thousands of miles really fast, and this has resulted in some really unseen adverse effects on our sleep pattern. So a plane moving from one part of the world to another goes so fast that our internal 24-hour clock can't keep up or adjust to the change in the difference from one part of the world to another. So to give you an example, if I was traveling from London to Karachi in Pakistan, so Karachi is 4 hours ahead of London. So when I get to Karachi, let's say at 9 a.m. in the morning, it's still 5 a.m. London time. So I still want to be sleeping. Equally, when it's 10 p.m. in Karachi, London is 6 p.m. So whereas everybody else wants to go to sleep, I want to stay awake. Okay? So this mismatch is what we call jet lag, will correct itself slowly as daylight begins to readjust my internal clock. But it takes time. It takes roughly 1 day to correct each hour of jet lag.
So you also mentioned a second factor that helps us sleep?
Yes. So that second factor makes us want to sleep is the concentration of what I call the sleep chemical in the brain. So as we get closer towards nighttime, the amount of this chemical in our brains gradually builds up. And this chemical then causes parts of our brain to be less active and pushes us to want to sleep.
So I know lots of people, including myself, who use or have used tea and coffee to delay sleep because, of course, they contain caffeine, whether it's I need to stay up to do an assignment or maybe I'm with friends and I want to watch a movie. How does caffeine work on our brains?
So this is something really important for people to know more about. First of all, caffeine interferes with the natural brain chemical that promotes sleep. So a couple of things to know about caffeine. First of all, caffeine is not just a food supplement. It's actually a psychoactive drug. And we don't often use the word drug with caffeine, but it actually is. In fact, it's the most widely used and abused stimulant in the world. Tea and coffee, and it's really surprising, it's the second most traded commodity after oil. So it's really big business in the world. So how does caffeine work? Well, it works by blocking the areas of the brain where the natural sleep chemical acts. The analogy is a bit like sticking your finger in your ear, so it stops you from hearing properly. That's what caffeine does when it's blocking parts of the receptors in the brain where the sleep chemical normally acts. The chemical is still outside, it just can't get in there. Put another way, caffeine tricks your brain into feeling awake by preventing the sleep chemical from doing its job. Another really important thing to be aware of when it comes to tea and coffee is it takes roughly about 30 minutes for that cup of tea that I've just had now to begin to have its effect. But it stays in our bodies, it stays in our system. Do you know how long, Fatima?
So I don't know, but I would guess around 2 to 3 hours maybe.
Okay, so roughly 5 to 7 hours.
Oh, wow, okay.
So if I've had a cup of tea now, okay, and it's, let's say, 2 o'clock, it takes 5 to 7 hours for that tea or coffee to start having 50% less of its effect.
Just 50%?
Just 50%.
Okay.
So the take-home message, I suppose, is the later you have in the day tea and coffee, the more impact it's going to have on your sleep.
I would, do you know, that makes me think, I think maybe 5 o'clock is an okay time to have a cup of coffee, but then that means at midnight it's still at 50%. So that can definitely have an effect on your sleep. Wow.
And the other thing about caffeine is that lots of different things, not just tea and coffee, have caffeine, including, for example, certain foods, chocolate, ice cream, even some painkillers. So when I go and buy paracetamol extra.
Yeah.
The extra bit is caffeine.
Right, okay. So from my own experience of having caffeine, I will generally feel an increased amount of energy and I'll feel more awake, and then suddenly I have almost like a drop in this energy. Can you explain to me what that experience is?
So like I mentioned earlier, the analogy I used was having caffeine is a bit like putting your finger in your ear. It stops you from hearing properly. So you can imagine when the effects of caffeine completely disappear out of the body.
Yeah.
It's a bit it's like when you pull your finger out of your ear, the sleep chemical in your brain has built up. It's just not had its effect. So once caffeine leaves the body, that sleep chemical suddenly rushes into those parts of the brain that it needs to act on, and you crash to sleep. The other way is the caffeine crash that people describe.